they have on pricing. So before we assumed that everyone was a price taker, everyone was competitive, that meant that if a firm tried to charge a price that was even a little bit above the market price, they would sell nothing. Or that if they tried to decrease their quantity or increase their quantity, that wouldn't change the market price at all. And this is almost never literally satisfied in a market, and in many markets, it's not even a very good approximation, especially if we want to have a more detailed understanding of what prices look like. So today we'll start studying the incentives that firms have, not just to choose how much to produce given the prices, but to try to choose how much to produce in order to influence the prices. So we'll start by talking about what a monopoly is and when we can apply it. We'll then talk about the monopolist's incentive to reduce quantity. Then about marginal revenue, which we'll develop both from a mathematical and a graphical perspective. We'll then talk about Lerner's elasticity pricing rule and how it leads us to think about the basic trade-offs that a monopolist faces, as well as alternative ways of measuring market power. We'll then talk about an example of measuring an actual monopoly demand curve. We'll then talk about dead weight loss and how it's been measured in the economy, as well as how it relates to the pass-through of taxes. Okay. Company out there, right? That's sort of what monopoly sort of means, right? But the basic mechanisms we're going to explore today are not about, there's only one firm out there, but rather apply to any case where firms don't act like a price taker, where their behavior, the quantities they produce, take into account the fact that they affect the prices in the market. You can think of them as being, in some sense, a monopolist. And the question is just then, how large of a monopoly distortion will they impose? Well, that'll depend on, how much they affect prices. But the basic logic of the monopoly model is consistent with that. And therefore, we can sort of think of any time a firm affects prices, any time it does a downward sloping residual demand curve, that is the demand curve given everybody else in the market, we can think of them as, in some sense, a monopoly. So the question then is, in what cases does it make sense to use a monopoly model versus a competitive or an oligopoly model? We'll study oligopoly models later in the course. And the basic things that are left out of a monopoly model, which are included in an oligopoly model, are first of all, in the monopoly model, we take as fixed the demand curve facing the firm. When we think about putting a tax on the firm or putting regulation on the firm, right? But if putting some sort of regulation on the firm changes the behavior of other firms in the industry, that will affect that firm's demand curve and not just what they do given that demand curve, right? And so any such effects through the equilibrium behavior of other firms are ignored in the monopoly model. Second, the monopoly model ignores any effects on the welfare that come through the welfare. Takes away profitable sales from another firm, that can harm the other firm. That can cause a real externality on them. If they just change the prices, that's just a pecuniary externality. But if they actually change the quantity that other firms are able to sell profitably, that can be a real externality on the other firms. And the monopoly model can't take that into account because it only has the one firm that we're considering in the model. And finally, the monopoly model can never be used to study the effects of changes in the structure of an industry. So for example, if we want to think, what's the effect of the entry of another firm? Or what's the effect of the merger of two firms? A monopoly model is just not going to be very useful to think about that because it only has one firm in it, right? nonetheless, in many situations, even when there naturally involves more firms, the monopoly model can be a useful guide to us. So for example, if we wanted to think, when another firm comes into the industry, that may make my good, that may create a substitute for my good. That may make it harder for me to influence price. The monopoly model would tell us that we might actually reduce price and therefore increase the amount that we're selling, even though we're facing a competitor. Because the elasticity of my demand, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, will rise in that case. That would never come out of a competitive model, but it might come out of a monopoly model, even though the basic force that's driving things is some amount of competition for someone else. Okay. So the most basic idea of a monopoly is that they have an incentive to reduce the quantity below the place where price is equal to marginal cost in order to raise the price at which the goods are sold. Because they want to get a higher price on the inframarginal units that they're selling. Those are the units that they'll sell regardless of exactly where the price is. And they wouldn't have this problem if they were able to charge higher prices to the people who are willing to pay a lot than the people who are willing to pay less. In that case, they wouldn't have to raise the price on everyone in order to charge a lot to the people who are willing to pay a lot. And we're going to talk more about this possibility of discriminating among different consumers on Thursday. But in the meantime, let's just think about what happens if the monopoly can only charge one price, if they've got to charge the same price to everyone. And they're not going to charge at the point where price is equal to marginal cost. Instead, they're going to reduce quantities to raise prices below that, and we'll talk about by exactly how much in a couple of minutes. But in the meantime, Vidor? Yeah. Can you think of some examples of a monopoly reducing quantity in order to try to raise prices in the real world?
Like diamond companies reducing the flow of diamonds?
That's an absolutely perfect example. Yeah. So the De Beers owns something like 85% of all diamonds in the world, and basically diamonds are not scarce. This is something that most people don't know. Diamonds are actually extremely abundant. There's like enough diamonds for everyone in the world to have like a 24-karat diamond. But the thing is, they're all in a very few places, right? So they're all in like some giant pile somewhere. And De Beers owns that pile. And De Beers just keeps the overwhelming majority of diamonds locked up underground rather than distributing them just to keep up the price of diamonds, right? That's sort of probably the most famous and powerful example. Another example is the occupational licensure example we talked about in the first class. Labor unions who try to keep people out by closed shop legislation that says you have to be part of the union in order to work at the firm. Farmers that form cooperatives to try to reduce overproduction that, destructively reduces prices in the industry. Drug cartels. If you think about what the main job of being a drug kingpin is, it is not producing cocaine. The main job is killing other people who produce cocaine, right? So the most effective drug enforcement agency in the world are the Mexican cartels. Because their primary goal is to stop other people from trafficking cocaine, not to traffic cocaine themselves. So they really shouldn't be called drug traffickers, they should be called drug enforcers. So in fact, when Pablo Escobar, who is probably the most effective drug kingpin of all time, was killed by the US government, the prices of cocaine dramatically fell and the quantity of cocaine coming to the US dramatically increased. Because basically the main thing he was doing our job as the United States of eradicating coca. The main thing he was not doing was bringing cocaine to the US, it was reducing the cocaine that was brought by everybody else. Similarly, drug companies, legal drug companies, invest lots of money in making sure that the drugs that they sell in developing countries don't get re-imported into the United States, because they would reduce the prices there. Similarly, I don't know if any of you has ever been the subject of a lawsuit by one of the record companies, but many students often are, because they're like downloading massive amount of stuff illegally. Those lawsuits are specifically designed to reduce the availability of music to try to raise its price, right? Okay. So in order to represent this, we're going to think about the revenue function, which is the price times the quantity, right? Under perfect competition, you would set price equal to marginal cost, but now you're going to set the derivative of your revenue equal to marginal cost, and that's no longer just price, because the price can change when the quantity changes. And by the product rule, Eric, is Eric here? No, he's not. Eric won. No. Does anyone else want to just do the product rule on my revenue and tell me what the marginal revenue is? Yeah, go ahead, Tejas.
So P times Q, like that is PQ is one variable, right? Or,
yeah.
So then plus P prime Q times Q, right? Because it's the first.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right, Tejas. So that's just the product rule, right? So as Tejas said, the marginal revenue is the price, and that's the part we want to be there, right? Because they're going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So if we didn't have this second term, we would be in business. It would just be like competition. But unfortunately, we've got this P prime times Q. What is that? If I increase my quantity, I reduce the price that I get on all the units that I'm already selling. So this is the inframarginal quantity, and this is the reduction in price that comes from increasing my quantity. And so this means that, first of all, the second term is always negative. So the marginal revenue is always below the demand curve as long as demand is downward sloping. And this gives me an incentive to reduce the quantity. That is to raise, in order to raise the price on the inframarginal goods. And the distortion is going to be proportional to the amount that I'm selling, the inframarginal quantity, and how much the price changes when I increase my quantity. That is, the more I'm a big player, I'm selling a lot and I affect the price a lot, the more I'm going to want to reduce the quantity. Okay, so let's go through and derive some examples of marginal revenue curves using the most common demand curves. So first let's start with the quadratic demand curve, which is a concave demand curve. And Justin Cipiora? No. Anyone else want to tell me what the marginal revenue curve associated with this is? Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
Okay, so we have to first derive P of Q. P of Q is going to be...
Well, this is P of Q up there, right?
Yeah, P prime of Q.
Yes.
Is going to be minus 2Q squared. Minus 2Q, and
Yes.
then you have to multiply it by Q,
Yes.
which is going to be minus 2Q squared.
Yeah.
And then you have to get PQ and subtract that from PQ.
Yep. So there's P of Q, so that's 1 minus Q squared.
Minus 2Q squared.
So we get 1 minus 3Q squared,
Yes.
right? Very well done. Okay. So the thing to notice about this is that this diverges increasingly rapidly from the demand curve, right? If the quantity is equal to 0, they're both 1, right? But then this quadratically diverges from this, right? So as Q gets bigger, these get further and further apart from 1, right? Okay, how about for linear demand, Suraj?
So multiply P of Q times Q, so that gives you Q minus Q squared.
Yeah?
And then derive that, so that's 1 minus 2Q.
Exactly. So this is going to, again, be the same as the demand curve when the quantity is 0. And it will diverge from it. It's steeper than the demand curve is, so it'll move apart. But it'll move apart at a constant rate. So this one diverged increasingly.